Get the police out here now. They are taping off the entire site. Gregory, what did you do? My CEO's voice cracked with pure panic over the phone. I took a slow sip of my coffee and deleted the voicemail. To understand how a $38 million municipal transit project ended up locked down by police tape and safety inspectors on a Tuesday morning, you have to understand how big-time commercial construction actually works in the state of California. Most people think a construction company is just a bunch of guys in yellow vests, some heavy machinery, and a pile of concrete. But in reality, it is a house of cards held together by three things: licenses, insurance, and bonds. If you pull just one of those cards out, the whole thing collapses. My name is Gregory Vance. For 12 years, I was the senior estimator and project manager at Apex Construction Group. I am 48 years old, with graying hair and hands that have held more rolls of blueprints than I care to remember. In the commercial construction industry in Northern California, everyone knows that a building is only as strong as the license that permits its existence. Under California law, a corporation cannot simply hire laborers and start digging. The Contractors State License Board, or CSLB, requires every licensed construction entity to have an individual who qualifies the license. This individual must possess the required experience and pass rigorous technical examinations. There are two main ways to do this: as a responsible managing officer, or RMO, or as a responsible managing employee, or RME. For 12 years, I was the RME for Apex. I held the Class A General Engineering Contractor license, number 847291, to maintain RME status under California Business and Professions Code, Section 7068. I was legally required to work a minimum of 32 hours per week, or 80% of the company's operating hours, actively supervising and controlling the construction operations. It was not an honorary title. I bore all the legal and technical liability under Section 7068.1. If a shoring wall collapsed, if a crane tipped, or if a subcontractor performed substandard structural welding, the regulatory board and the district attorney would hold me personally responsible. I carried that weight every single day. The company's founder, Richard Caldwell, understood this. Richard was an old-school builder who started in the 1970s with a single backhoe and a reputation for quality. When he hired me, we structured an agreement that reflected the value of my Class A license and my estimating expertise. In addition to my base salary, my employment contract guaranteed me a project acquisition bonus. For private developments, it was 1% of the contract value. For complex public works projects, which required intense regulatory compliance and technical submittals, it was 2%. The contract stated that the bonus was payable upon the owner's issuance of the Notice to Proceed, or NTP. For 9 months, my life was consumed by the Mission Bay Transit Hub. The San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, or SFMTA, had put out a bid for a multimodal transit center in the heart of a high-density redevelopment zone. The project was an engineering nightmare. The geotechnical reports showed that the site sat on reclaimed tidal mud, specifically SF Bay mud, with a blow count of less than 5. The soil was essentially the consistency of toothpaste, saturated with high groundwater. A standard open excavation would cause the adjacent municipal streets and utility lines to slide into the pit. We needed a complex temporary shoring system using 36-inch diameter secant piles, drilled 60 feet deep and overlapping each other to create a watertight structural barrier. After excavation, we would have to drive cast-in-place concrete foundation piles deep into the bedrock. I worked 80-hour weeks. I managed the quantities takeoff, checked the structural steel fabrication schedules, and negotiated with specialty shoring subcontractors. I had to ensure compliance with California Public Contract Code Section 4100, the Subletting and Subcontracting Fair Practices Act, which meant every subcontractor listed in our bid had to be fully vetted and could not be substituted without strict city approval. I calculated crew productivity rates, crane lift radiuses, hazardous material containment protocols, and city traffic control permits. If I underestimated the concrete pour rates by even 5%, Apex would lose its entire profit margin. When the bids were opened at the SFMTA headquarters on Van Ness Avenue, Apex was the low bidder at $38,400,000. We beat our nearest competitor, a massive national firm, by just $38,000. It was a masterpiece of estimating. Richard and I celebrated in his office. He poured us 2 glasses of bourbon and told me that this project would secure the company's future and that my bonus of $768,000 was well-deserved. It was the payout that would secure my family's financial future. But 2 weeks before the NTP was scheduled to be issued, Richard suffered a massive heart attack. He survived, but his doctors warned him that returning to the high-stress environment of commercial construction would kill him. Richard retired immediately, handing control of Apex to his son, Ryan. Ryan Caldwell was 34, possessed an MBA from an expensive East Coast university, and wore pristine leather work boots that had never seen a muddy job site. He did not view construction as a craft. He viewed it as a spreadsheet to be optimized. He immediately hired Emily Thorne, a cold, numbers-driven CFO whose sole purpose was to cut overhead. Within days, Ryan began speaking of restructuring and streamlining the company. He looked at my 12-year-old employment contract not as a binding agreement with the man who qualified his license, but as an outdated liability that was eating into his profit margins. As the date for the SFMTA's notice to proceed approached, the silence from the third floor regarding my bonus became deafening. On a Thursday morning, the official notice to proceed from the SFMTA arrived in my inbox. It was a digital PDF signed by the city's Director of Transportation, authorizing Apex Construction Group to begin site mobilization and excavation for the Mission Bay Transit Hub starting the following Monday. According to the contract I had signed with Richard Caldwell, this notice triggered the payment of my 2% project acquisition bonus of $768,000. I printed out the NTP, grabbed my folder containing the subcontractor mobilization schedule, and went to Ryan's third-floor office. I expected a routine review of the initial field setup. Instead, I found Ryan sitting behind his desk, with Emily Thorne standing near the window and Tyler Evans sitting in a guest chair. Tyler was Ryan's brother-in-law, a residential home renovator whose only qualification for commercial heavy civil construction was his marriage to Ryan's sister. I sat down and placed the SFMTA document on his desk. I requested Ryan sign the bonus disbursement authorization so Emily could release the funds. Ryan did not look at the paper. He leaned forward and told me that Apex was facing rising material costs and tight margins, and that my 2% bonus was a cash flow drain that the project could not support. Emily Thorne stepped forward holding a black folder. She stated that my 2014 contract was outdated and out of line with modern industry standards. She offered a new employment agreement that replaced the acquisition bonus with a discretionary bonus of up to $50,000 upon successful on-time completion of the transit hub, subject to target profit margins. I told Ryan I would not sign the new agreement, as the original contract was active, binding, and the NTP had been officially issued. Ryan's friendly demeanor vanished. He slammed his hand on the desk, accusing me of holding the company hostage and refusing to be a team player. He claimed that under California law, Apex was an at-will employer, and that my refusal to sign the new terms constituted insubordination. Emily opened the folder and slid a termination notice and a severance agreement across the desk. She offered a $50,000 severance package, contingent on my signing a full release of all claims, waiving my right to sue for the acquisition bonus or wrongful termination. I told them I would not sign the waiver. Ryan smiled and told me to hire a lawyer and sue them. He claimed his corporate law firm was on a monthly retainer and would drag the case out in court for 5 years until I went bankrupt. He added that Tyler Evans was taking over as project manager on Monday and that they did not need me. I stood up, leaving the severance documents on the desk. I walked down to my cubicle, packed my personal belongings, my wet ink stamp, my engineering handbooks, and my personal reference files into a cardboard box. I left my corporate laptop and phone on the desk. 10 minutes later, I drove away from the office. I felt no anger, only a sharp, cold focus. I drove straight to downtown San Francisco, to the law office of my older brother Arthur Vance, a construction attorney who spent his career dealing with mechanics, liens, and licensing disputes. I explained the situation and handed him my termination notice. Arthur looked up the CSLB public database and confirmed that Apex's Class A license was active under my name as the RME. He explained the legal trap. Under California Business and Professions Code Section 7068.1 as the RME, I was legally responsible for the direct supervision and control of all construction operations. If I was no longer employed by Apex, but my name remained on their license, I would carry personal civil and criminal liability for any accident or structural failure on their job site. If Tyler Evans made a mistake, the state would hold me responsible. Under Section 768.2, I was legally required to notify the CSLB of my disassociation. Arthur explained that Ryan was likely planning to exploit the CSLB 90-day grace period to get the project started, hoping to find a cheap replacement qualifier or pressure an employee to pass the Class A exam in the meantime. But Arthur pointed out that while the CSLB allows a 90-day grace period for private work, public works contracts are much stricter. Under SFMTA Contract Section 10A, the contractor must maintain a fully qualified active license with an approved certified qualifier actively supervising the project at all times. Section 14.2 required Apex to report any change in key personnel to the city within 10 days. Arthur turned his keyboard toward me. I logged into my CSLB portal and submitted the Form 13A-1, the disassociation of qualifier, certifying under penalty of perjury that I was no longer employed by Apex and was withdrawing my technical qualification. The system processed the change immediately. Next, Arthur drafted a formal letter to Marcus Henderson, the lead contract officer for the SFMTA, notifying the city that as of that day, I was no longer the RME or qualifier for Apex Construction Group and would not be supervising the Mission Bay Transit Hub project. We attached the CSLB disassociation confirmation and sent the email. The legal mechanism was now in motion. On Monday morning, the gates of the Mission Bay Transit Hub job site swung open, and the silence was replaced by the roar of diesel engines. Apex Construction Group mobilized with 2 heavy Caterpillar excavators, a fleet of dump trucks, and a crew of 40 union laborers and carpenters. Tyler Evans was on site early, wearing a pristine white hard hat and a reflective vest that still had the creases from the packaging. He was eager to show the crews that he was in charge, directing the excavators to begin the primary excavation for the utility corridor. However, the SFMTA had already received my formal email on Thursday afternoon. Rather than launching a dramatic raid on Monday morning, the City Contract Administration followed the strict guidelines of public procurement. On Friday afternoon, a courier delivered a formal notice of non-compliance to the Apex corporate office. The document stated that the city had been notified of the disassociation of the designated responsible managing employee, Gregory Vance. Under SFMTA Contract Section 10A, Apex was officially granted a 5-day cure period to submit the credentials of a replacement Class A qualifier for city approval. Ryan Caldwell, consulting with his newly hired corporate attorneys, decided to play a game of chicken. His lawyers assured him that the CSLB allowed a 90-day grace period to replace a qualifier, and they believed they could tie up the city's compliance division in administrative meetings for weeks. Ryan ordered Tyler to push forward with the excavation. He wanted to get the first concrete mud slab poured as quickly as possible, believing that once the concrete was in the ground, the city would be hesitant to halt the project. The excavation site was located on reclaimed land, composed of soft San Francisco Bay mud. Geotechnically, Bay mud is classified as a highly cohesive, highly compressible clay with very low shear strength. To dig a 20-foot deep trench in this soil, next to a busy municipal road like 3rd Street, you need a highly engineered shoring system. The plans I had estimated called for interlocking steel sheet piles driven 60 feet into the ground, braced horizontally by heavy steel whale beams and cross struts. By Tuesday afternoon, the excavators had reached a depth of 15 feet. Tyler, in an effort to save time and equipment rental costs, had delayed the installation of the horizontal whale beams. He ordered the crews to keep digging, planning to install the bracing after the excavation reached the final depth. I knew the danger of what Tyler was doing. As the excavation deepened, the lateral pressure of the saturated mud behind the sheet piles began to build. On Tuesday evening, a superintendent who was still loyal to me sent me a text message with photos of the excavation. The steel sheet piles were visibly bowing inward at the center, and water was piping through the joints, bringing liquefied mud into the bottom of the pit. Tiny hairline cracks had begun to spider across the asphalt of the adjacent sidewalk on 3rd Street. It was a classic pre-collapse condition. I immediately contacted the CSLB Field Enforcement Division and the San Francisco Department of Building Inspection. I reported that Apex was operating a major civil excavation without a qualified Class A supervisor, and that the excavation was actively undermining the public right-of-way due to unbraced shoring. At 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the trap snapped shut. A convoy of city vehicles pulled up to the job site gate. Out stepped Marcus Henderson, the lead compliance officer for the SFMTA, accompanied by CSLB field investigator Sarah Jenkins, city building inspector Bill Davis, and 2 San Francisco police cruisers. Tyler Evans walked over to the gate, trying to block their entry. He demanded to know why they were interrupting his project. Sarah Jenkins did not waste time. She pulled out her CSLB credentials and demanded to see the project manager and the designated license qualifier. Tyler stated that he was the project manager. Sarah then asked for the location of Gregory Vance, the RME listed on the active building permits. Tyler stammered, explaining that Gregory was no longer with the company, but that he, Tyler, was fully capable of supervising the work. Sarah asked Tyler what license classification he personally held. Tyler admitted he held a Class B license. Sarah informed him that a Class B license is legally restricted to residential and light commercial building and does not authorize the supervision of heavy civil engineering works, including deep shoring and public utility relocations. She added that operating beyond the scope of a license classification on a public works project is a direct violation of California Business and Professions Code, Section 7028. Meanwhile, Bill Davis, the building inspector, walked to the edge of the excavation pit. He looked down at the bowing sheet piles and the water accumulating at the bottom of the trench. He pointed to the cracks forming in the asphalt of the adjacent sidewalk. He turned to Tyler and asked for the stamped engineering calculations for the unbraced excavation. Tyler had no answer. Bill Davis turned to the police officers. He stated that the excavation was in imminent danger of collapse, posing a hazard to the public utility lines and the traffic on 3rd Street. He pulled a red, laminated emergency stop work order from his clipboard and stapled it to the door of the job site trailer. He told Tyler that all work must cease immediately and that if he did not clear all personnel from the excavation within 10 minutes, he would have the police arrest Tyler for reckless endangerment. The police officers began escorting the laborers out of the pit. Outside the gate, 3 concrete transit mixers from Cemex were idling, scheduled to pour the initial mud slab. Tyler begged the inspectors to let him pour the concrete to stabilize the bottom of the trench, but Bill Davis refused. The drivers, realizing they could not pour and that the concrete would soon harden in their drums, turned their trucks around and drove away. Apex was billed $15,000 for the wasted concrete and disposal fees, in addition to the mandatory 4-hour show-up pay for the 40 idle union workers. By noon, the formal notice of the stop work order and the safety violations had been transmitted to Liberty Surety. The underwriters at the surety company realized that Apex was now in material breach of the SFMTA contract and facing default on a $38 million bond. To protect the surety from a massive payout, their legal team immediately invoked Section 4 of the General Agreement of Indemnity, the collateral security clause, which Apex had signed to secure the bonds. The surety's attorneys drafted a formal demand for collateral and sent it to Wells Fargo's commercial banking division. Under the terms of the indemnity agreement, the bank was legally required to freeze Apex's project escrow accounts and their primary construction line of credit to prevent the dissipation of assets. By 2 o'clock, the financial paralysis was complete. The subcontractors, including the electrical and structural steel firms, attempted to submit their weekly progress billings, only to find the payment portal deactivated. When they learned that Apex's construction line of credit had been frozen by Wells Fargo, they immediately pulled their crews off the site. My phone rang at 2:30. It was Ryan. His voice was no longer arrogant. It was cracked with panic and fury. He screamed into the phone, accusing me of sabotage and demanding to know how I had frozen his accounts. He claimed that my disassociation filing was a targeted strike designed to extort the company for the acquisition bonus, and he threatened to sue me for $10 million for tortious interference and breach of loyalty. I listened to him scream until he ran out of breath. Then I spoke in a calm, level tone. I told Ryan that I had not sabotaged his company. I explained that I had filed the Form 13A-1 because I was legally required to do so under California law. If I had allowed my license to remain attached to Apex while Tyler supervised a dangerous excavation without whale bracing, I would be facing criminal negligence charges and the loss of my livelihood. I told him that he had tried to build a $38 million heavy civil project using a residential contractor's license, and that his own ignorance of construction law was what had frozen his accounts. I told him to direct all further calls to my brother Arthur, and I hung up. By Thursday morning, the corporate offices of Apex Construction Group were in a state of absolute panic. The stop work order on the Mission Bay Transit Hub was costing the company $50,000 a day in liquidated damages to the SFMTA. In addition, the specialty subcontractors had submitted formal claims for demobilization costs and idle equipment rentals, which were accumulating at a rate of $30,000 a day. The board of directors realized that if the project director's project remained dormant for another 48 hours, the SFMTA would formally terminate the contract for default. A termination for default is the ultimate disaster for a public works contractor. If a city agency defaults you, your performance bond is called, and the surety company pays to finish the project using another contractor. The surety then sues your corporation and its individual owners to recover every penny under the indemnity agreement. Furthermore, a default goes onto the National Contractor Database, meaning you can never secure a performance bond again. Without bonding, Apex would be unable to bid on any public project in the country, effectively destroying the business. Ryan's corporate legal team had spent Wednesday night reviewing the contract and the CSLB regulations. They were forced to deliver the harsh truth to Ryan and Emily Thorne. Gregory Vance's disassociation was not a breach of contract, but a legal requirement under state safety laws. Apex had zero chance of winning a tortious interference lawsuit. Furthermore, the lawyers confirmed that replacing a Class A RME was a process that took a minimum of 3 to 6 months due to CSLB background checks and SFMTA qualification reviews. They had no cards left to play. The board of directors held an emergency meeting on Thursday morning. They voted to suspend Ryan Caldwell's executive authority and begged Richard Caldwell, the retired founder, to return and resolve the crisis. Richard, despite his fragile health, agreed to step in. At 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, a meeting was convened at my brother Arthur's law office on Montgomery Street. I sat next to Arthur at the conference table. Richard Caldwell entered the room, walking slowly and leaning heavily on his cane. He looked exhausted, but his eyes carried the sharp authority of a man who had built a successful enterprise from nothing. Ryan followed him, slouching, his eyes fixed on the floor, looking like a beaten employee. Emily Thorne sat next to them, her laptop open but her hands trembling slightly. Richard looked at me. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep disappointment. He looked at Ryan and told him that he had nearly destroyed the company in 2 weeks with his corporate spreadsheets and arrogance. He stated that in the construction industry, a company's reputation, its contracts, and its licenses are the only things that keep the business alive. Arthur slid our formal settlement agreement across the table. He stated that the terms were non-negotiable. If Apex did not execute the agreement by the end of the day, we would file a formal breach of contract and wage theft lawsuit in the San Francisco Superior Court and notify the SFMTA of the company's permanent regulatory non-compliance. Arthur detailed the financial terms of the settlement. First, Apex would pay Gregory Vance his full project acquisition bonus of $768,000 plus a 10% late payment penalty of $76,800. Totaling $844,800. Second, Apex would pay a wrongful termination and severance settlement of $200,000. Third, Gregory would not return as an employee. Instead, to resolve the license vacancy and get the stop work order lifted, Gregory would sign a 6-month independent consulting agreement to act as the interim RME qualifier for Apex. The consulting fee was $25,000 a month, with a minimum 6-month retainer of $150,000 paid up front. Gregory would have final authority over all quality control, safety compliance, and structural submittals on the Mission Bay Transit Hub project, but his on-site time would be limited to a maximum of 10 hours per week. Finally, Ryan Caldwell was to be permanently removed as CEO, and Tyler Evans was to be terminated from the company immediately. Ryan stood up, his face red with anger, and argued that the terms were extortion and that the company could not afford to pay over $1 million from its cash reserves. Richard slammed his cane against the conference table, silencing Ryan. Richard shouted that the company was facing bankruptcy within 10 days if the stop order was not lifted. He pointed out that they were losing $50,000 a day in liquidated damages and that their lines of credit were frozen. He told Ryan that corporate lawyers could not pour concrete or qualify a license and ordered him to sit down and be quiet. Richard turned to Emily Thorne and ordered her to execute the wire transfers immediately. Emily accessed the corporate banking portal. Because the surety company had frozen the accounts, Emily had to coordinate with Liberty Surety's risk officer, who was standing by on the phone. Once the surety's attorney reviewed the signed settlement agreement, they authorized Wells Fargo to release the specific funds for the transfer. Arthur monitored his escrow account. Within 20 minutes, the wire transfers were confirmed. A total of $1,194,800 had been deposited into my account. Richard signed the settlement agreement on behalf of Apex, followed by Emily. I signed last. Richard shook my hand and requested that I help save his project. I told him I would file the paperwork immediately. That afternoon, I logged into the CSLB portal and submitted the paperwork to associate as the interim RME for Apex Construction Group. The CSLB database was updated by Friday morning, showing the company's license was back in full compliance. The SFMTA immediately lifted the stop work order. On Friday morning, I drove down to the Mission Bay job site. The excavators were back in operation, and the concrete trucks were lined up at the gate. Tyler Evans was gone, replaced by a seasoned superintendent I had worked with for years. Ryan had been demoted and sent by his father to manage a small gravel quarry in eastern Oregon, far away from any major municipal projects. I stood at the edge of the pit, watching the first concrete pour begin. I was no longer an employee. I was no longer working 80 hours a week, and I was no longer carrying the stress of the corporate boardroom. I was an independent consultant, $1 million richer, and in complete control of my career. Ryan had tried to fire me to save $1. In the end, he learned a lesson that every arrogant developer eventually learns the hard way. Never fire the man who holds the keys to the gate.